Good morning. In today's read aloud, we're going to be learning about the family life of the Norse people. And so several vocabulary words will come up. You will hear about embers, which are glowing pieces left over from a dying fire. Extracted means to pulling something out from something else. Um, Interrogate is to question someone thoroughly. Livestock, animals that are used for farming. Population, the total number of people living in an area. And a tunic, which is a slip on piece of clothing that's usually knee length or a little bit longer, and it's often belted at the waist. So, we have been talking about Norsemen and that they traveled to other places to trade, to raid, and explore other lands. What would Bjorn have called a warrior who went on a raid? That's right, a Viking. That's right. And Viking ships were called longships or drakars. And there were certain type of warriors who worked themselves up into a war-friendly frenzy, and they were called berserkers. They went berserk. Well, the Norsemen also relied on trading to gain goods. Do you remember how trading works? And what would a Viking Age import or export be? Imported, it came in silver, grain, spices, silk, and glass. Exports, things that they had a lot of and could trade away, slaves, furs, fish, timber, ivory, and woolen cloth. When they went trading, they had a special kind of ship, a cargo ship called a canar. And remember, the Norse people also fished and farmed their own homeland in Scandinavia, and they would have their own little rowboat or fairing. We're going to hear today more about the daily life of Bjorn and his family. As we crept inside the house, I could tell that almost everyone was asleep. Only my father was still awake, and I could just make out his shadowy profile as he sat on the ground near the fire, where only the glowing embers remained. "See you in the morning," whispered Tolly, as he attempted to creep away into the darkness. "Boys, come here a moment," my father said in a raised whisper. He was not going to let either of us get away quite so easily. "Where have you been?" he asked as we sat down beside him. At first, neither of us responded, until finally I muttered, "At the wharf, Father." "What were you doing there?" he asked, continuing to interrogate us. "Looking at the ships," offered Tolly. "One of the warships is being ready for a raid." "Is that so?" he replied. "Tolly would like to go with them," I offered. "But not you?" he said, as if he were stating a fact. I did not reply. "A warrior does not always know when he is ready to be a warrior," he said softly. "Only Odin and Tyr know that. When the time for fighting arrives, you will both be ready. Now, get some sleep. You have chores to do in the morning." Tolly and I stood up and kissed my father, and then we scuttled off into the darkness of the central hall. "See you bright and early in the morning," I teased Tolly, knowing that he hated to get up before the sun had risen in the sky. I took off my woolen tunic and lay down. It felt good to rest my head upon my down pillow. I pulled my woolen blanket up around me and closed my eyes. My grandmother was always the first one to get up. Each morning, before sunrise, she made porridge and bread for the entire family. Shortly after she arose, my father and mother would join her by the hearth. Mother would add logs to the embers, and father would disappear into his forge. Within minutes, Uncle Sven, My mother's brother would join my father, and the day's work would begin. The sound of the hammer hitting the anvil and the hiss of hot metal and fire were never far away. I lay in the semi-darkness listening to the early morning hustle and bustle. These were the sounds of my childhood. These were the memories that I would keep in my heart for the rest of my life. Suddenly my eyes began to water. I quickly pinched myself to stop the flow of tears. As the porridge simmered and the bread baked, Mother, grandmother, and Aunt Kristen went to work in the small room behind the central hall. This was the room where the sheep's wool was spun, woven on a loom, and sewn into warm clothes and blankets. Thread from flax was also woven into lighter linen garments that could be worn during the summer months. In addition to looking after the chickens, my sister Kitta was being taught as an apprentice how to spin, weave, and sew in the same way that I was being taught how to be a blacksmith. My Aunt Kristen was perhaps one of the most skillful women in our town at using vegetable dyes from plants to color woolen and linen cloth before it was cut and sewn into garments. She explained to me once that the color blue was extracted from the woad plant. The color red was extracted from madder, and yellow was extracted from weld. We children were responsible for gathering these plants. Tolly did not work as an apprentice like me. Instead, he worked on his uncle Eric's farm on the edge of town. There he tended the flock of sheep that provided many of the townspeople with wool. He also cared for the herd of cattle that provided additional milk, as well as meat. Although there was not a lot of it, the grain and vegetables produced in the fields were needed to feed our growing population. Even the long grass was used on the thatched roofs of our houses to cover the interior wooden floors, and very often in the late part of autumn, the older cattle were killed and the meat was dried. This provided much needed food in the wintertime. Tolly, Bjorn, Kitta, Arnsten, and Karl, it's time to get up, said Grandfather Affy as he shuffled toward us in the dim light. Come on, you sleepyheads, we need more wood for the fire, and we need some eggs. Oh, and get a pitcher of goat's milk, too, he ordered. I could just make out the younger children stretching and yawning. I could see that Tolly was the last one to lift his head from his pillow. I heard him yawn loudly several times and then down again. Moments later, Grandfather Affy threw one of his leather shoes at him and he fell backwards out of his bed. Come on, Tolly, let's go and chop some wood, I suggested, all the while laughing at him. Tolly grunted at me by way of a reply. Tolly and I worked together at chopping up the larger pieces of wood that were stored in an enclosure at the side of our house. Fortunately, our homeland had many forests that provided us with wood for our ships and homes, as well as fuel for the fires in our hearths. Wood was one of the few things we had in abundance. While we chopped wood into logs, Tolly and I discussed the journey that we would soon be taking across the great ocean to Iceland. You know, Bjorn, there are enormous sea monsters that can devour a man in one gulp. They dwell in the watery depths of the great ocean, he said quite seriously. It wasn't just the children who believed in sea monsters. The adults of the Viking Age believed in them as well. There weren't things like submarines or scuba equipment or scientists who devoted their lives to studying the ocean. A large whale or shark the Vikings had seen might have been thought to have been a sea monster. Well, I've heard stories about them, but I've never seen one, I replied calmly. Well, it's true, he continued. It is best to keep a spear by your side at all times, even while you're sleeping, Tolly advised me. You don't want to be caught unarmed if one arises up unexpectedly out of the waves. I wasn't sure a spear would be much use against a creature that Tolly had described, but I nodded in agreement. An hour must have passed when we heard the sound of our grandmother's voice calling us all into breakfast. She didn't have to call any of us twice. Tolly sprinted toward the house, and I followed behind him. We quickly washed our hands and faces in a bucket of fresh water that had been placed outside the entrance to our home. As soon as we sat down together around the hearth, Grandmother ladled porridge into wooden bowls, and then she handed them to us. Mother gave each of us a wooden spoon. In addition to the hot porridge, there was fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, and dried herring laid out on a large wooden platter. A pitcher of warm goat's milk was placed beside the platter. Each day, Viking families came together to eat 2 meals, breakfast and dinner. One of the 2, breakfast, was my favorite. At breakfast time, the older family members were less tired and therefore less grumpy, and the events of the day were still a mystery awaiting to happen. I sat on the floor between Tolly and Kidda and devoured the warm porridge. When I finished my bowl of porridge, I reached for some bread and cheese and then poured goat's milk into the wooden cup. "Eat up, Bjorn," said my father, smiling at me. "Today is the day we begin to make your sword." Ooh, cool. Were your predictions about what chores that Viking age men and women might do on a daily basis correct? Many ancient societies had people who had to do the same chores. You had to make your food, you had to make your clothing, all of those things. You had to take care of the animals that you owned. Describe the chores of Norse girls. Well, women and girls would spin sheep's wool and thread from flax, then sew it into clothes and blankets to keep warm. Girls would often look after the farm animals such as chickens, and they extracted the dyes from plants and vegetables to color garments. What were the chores of Norse boys? Boys were often apprentices, learning a skill such as blacksmithing, and they would also tend to livestock such as sheep, chop wood for fires. How was farming an important part of the daily life of the people of the Viking Age? Well, the town's sheep provided people with wool, cattle and goats provided milk and meat, grains and vegetables were an important food source, grass was used as roofs or floor coverings, and flax was used for clothing. Bjorn's father is waiting by the embers of the fire when Tolly and Bjorn return. Why does Bjorn's father interrogate them when they arrive home? They're late, and he wants to know what they've been doing. Why would Tolly be concerned about sea monsters? Because they are getting ready to sail to Iceland, and he's heard many myths about sea monsters that live in the ocean. You heard quite a bit about the meals and the different types of food that Bjorn's family eats. Describe the food that the Norse would eat for breakfast. Norse families often ate only 2 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. Breakfast usually consisted of porridge, fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, dried herring, and goat's milk. How is your breakfast different from a Viking breakfast, and how is your breakfast the same? Porridge is like having oatmeal, but it could be made from a different grain besides oat. All right, that's the end of that chapter.